Imagine stepping into an ancient Chinese marketplace thousands of years ago. The air is filled with the scent of steaming rice, sizzling meat skewers, and fresh herbs you may never have tasted before. The stalls are brimming with baskets of millet, roots pulled fresh from the earth, exotic fruits carried in on mule caravans, and mysterious fermented sauces brewing quietly in clay jars. It is a world both familiar and strange, because though the people of ancient China ate rice, noodles, vegetables, and meat like we do today, the way they cooked, flavored, and shared their meals would surprise you. Food was more than just survival. It was culture, medicine, and even a way to connect with the heavens. Welcome to History for Sleep, where we bring you long, calming explorations of history designed to ease your mind and help you drift into rest. Tonight, we're traveling through the kitchens, farms, and banquet halls of ancient China to discover what food really looked like in those times and how meals shaped an empire. If you're new here, don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you never miss a story, and let us know in the comments what time you usually listen in. Do you put these videos on as you falling asleep, or do you listen during the day to relax? And if there are any topics you'd love us to cover, let us know. Your ideas help us bring you the stories you want most. Stay with me, because by the end of this journey, you'll see food in a whole new way, not just as something to eat, but as a thread that ties people across time, culture, and belief. Ancient China as food is not only fascinating, but also deeply soothing to imagine. Steaming bowls of rice, cups of earthy tea, delicate dumplings floating in broth, and fragrant herbs simmering in clay pots. As you settle in, let the sounds of history become the background to your rest. Subscribe now, and let's begin our journey. To understand what food looked like in ancient China, we must begin with the earliest farmers who settled along the Yellow River and the Yangtze River. Long before dynasties were established, before palaces rose and cities bustled, there were small communities of people who learned that the land itself could be coaxed into feeding them. Around 10,000 years ago, hunter-gatherer societies began experimenting with cultivation, planting wild grains and taming the soil. The fertile valleys of these two rivers were perfect incubators for what would become one of the most influential food cultures in the world. The earliest evidence of agriculture in China points to millet farming along the Yellow River. Millet, a hardy grain with small golden seeds, could withstand the unpredictable climate of northern China. Its resilience made it a staple for centuries. Imagine a farmer bending low to scatter seeds across tilled earth, hoping the floods of spring would bring just enough water, but not too much to drown the crop. When harvested, millet could be boiled into porridge, ground into flour, or even fermented into a primitive kind of beer. For ancient communities, this grain was more than food. It was life, security, and stability. Without it, entire villages would not have survived the harsh northern winters. Meanwhile, along the Yangtze River in the south, another story was unfolding. The wetlands there nurtured wild rice, and over generations, communities learned to cultivate it deliberately. The transformation from wild rice to domesticated rice was gradual, but once mastered, rice fields began to spread like green carpets across the landscape. Unlike millet, rice demanded careful irrigation and patient tending, but the reward was bountiful harvests of grains that became the very heart of southern Chinese diets. Farmers built dikes, canals, and terraced fields, innovations that shaped not only how people ate, but also how they organized their lives. Entire communities revolved around the rhythm of planting and harvest, of water flowing and seeds sprouting. Food at this stage was simple but vital. Meals likely consisted of boiled grains, supplemented with foraged plants, nuts, and small amounts of meat from hunting. Archaeological evidence shows that early Chinese farmers still relied heavily on wild resources roots, berries, wild animals, and fish, but the shift to farming allowed for surplus food. Surplus meant storage, and storage meant the possibility of stability through winter and hard times. It also meant that not everyone had to hunt and gather daily. Some people could specialize in tool-making, weaving, or even ritual practices. In this way, the birth of Chinese cuisine is tied directly to the birth of Chinese civilization. Archaeologists have uncovered grinding stones worn smooth from years of use, suggesting that ancient farmers ground millet into flour for cakes or flatbreads. They also found charred remains of grains in fire pits, showing that porridge-like meals were common. Imagine sitting around a hearth, a clay pot simmering over flames, the earthy smell of millet porridge thick in the air. It would have been bland by modern standards, perhaps flavored only with wild herbs or a pinch of salt if available. Yet for those families, it was the taste of survival and comfort. Domestication did not stop with grains. As communities stabilized, people began experimenting with animals. Pigs were among the first to be domesticated in ancient China, their bones appearing in early settlements as evidence of a growing reliance on livestock. Pigs were easy to feed, consuming scraps and leftovers, and in return, they provided meat and fat that could be cooked, rendered, or preserved. Dogs, too, lived alongside humans, used for hunting assistance and occasionally as food in times of scarcity. Chickens eventually joined the domestic scene, though their role at this stage was modest compared to later periods. One fascinating aspect of early Chinese food culture is the connection between farming and ritual. The success of a harvest was never guaranteed, so people turned to offerings and ceremonies to ensure fertility of the land. Millet or rice might be placed on altars, offered to ancestors or spirits in the hope of protection and blessing. Food was not only nourishment for the living, but also a bridge to the unseen world. These practices laid the foundation for the deep cultural link between food, family, and spirituality that would endure throughout Chinese history. As centuries passed, tools became more sophisticated. Stone sickles with serrated edges gave way to bronze implements as metallurgy advanced. With better tools came more efficient farming, and with more efficient farming came population growth. Villages expanded, and trade between communities introduced variety into diets. A family that primarily ate millet might trade with a rice-growing community, creating a subtle blending of northern and southern traditions. Though China is vast and diverse, these early exchanges set the stage for the regional cuisines that later dynasties would celebrate. The diet of these first farmers was humble, and yet it contained the seeds of culinary greatness. Grains formed the base, but the ingenuity of people meant that no part of the harvest was wasted. Millet stalks could be used for fodder or fuel. Rice husks were used in pottery making, strengthening clay vessels that would simmer stews and porridges for years. This cycle of use and reuse demonstrates the resourcefulness of ancient farmers who worked with what they had to sustain their communities. Life was not easy, and meals were not lavish. Famine was a constant threat, and a poor harvest could mean hunger or even death. But within this struggle, Chinese civilization developed a resilience and a reverence for food that continues to this day. Even now, the phrases and traditions surrounding meals in China, such as greeting someone with "Have you eaten?" echo this ancient awareness of food's importance. By the time the first dynasties took shape, the foundation had been laid. Farming communities were thriving, grain storage was reliable, and domesticated animals were commonplace. What began as survival through millet and rice was transforming into culture, ritual, and identity. Ancient Chinese farmers did more than feed their families. They created the agricultural backbone of one of the world's great civilizations, and in doing so, they set the table for the incredible diversity of food that would follow. This was the dawn of Chinese food, simple yet profound, humble yet world-changing. From porridge simmering in clay pots to pigs snuffling in the farmyards, the first farmers gave rise to traditions that would echo for thousands of years. And though their meals might seem plain to us today, in their simplicity lies a beauty, the beginning of a story that will unfold in every chapter that follows. If millet was the grain of survival in northern China, then rice was the grain of abundance in the south. Few foods are as deeply woven into the fabric of Chinese life as rice, and its story stretches back thousands of years to the marshes and wetlands along the Yangtze River. Archaeologists have found charred grains of rice dating back nearly 10,000 years, proving that this humble grain was cultivated in some of the earliest human settlements. Over centuries, rice would become more than food. It was the rhythm of life, the foundation of culture, and a symbol of prosperity. The cultivation of rice required innovation. Unlike millet, which could survive with modest rainfall, rice demanded constant water. Farmers carved terraces into hillsides, creating step-like fields that could be flooded and drained with precision. Imagine looking out over a valley in ancient China and seeing the glittering reflection of the sun on waterlogged paddies, each one filled with young rice shoots standing like rows of green soldiers. The labor was intensive, but the results were worth it. Rice paddies could produce yields far greater than other grains, allowing communities to grow and populations to flourish. Rice also brought people together in cooperation. Managing irrigation required collective effort. Villages built dikes and canals, maintained channels, and worked in harmony to control the flow of water. This spirit of shared labor and mutual reliance helped shape not only farming practices, but also social structures. Food, in this sense, was not only sustenance, but also a force that bonded communities together. When harvested, rice offered endless possibilities. The simplest preparation was boiling, transforming the grains into steaming bowls of white or slightly brown rice, depending on the variety. But even in ancient times, cooks experimented with texture and flavor. Sticky rice, with its glutinous quality, became important in ritual foods and festivals. It could be pressed into cakes, wrapped in leaves, or molded into dumpling-like forms that carried symbolic meaning. For families, rice was both everyday sustenance and a treat for special occasions. Beyond the table, rice found symbolic power. In rituals, it was often offered to ancestors, a gift that represented continuity and respect. It was also used in weddings and festivals, symbolizing fertility and good fortune. In many ways, rice became a language of its own, communicating wishes for prosperity, health, and harmony. The fact that rice was so deeply embedded in rituals shows how food in ancient China was never only about eating. It was about meaning, tradition, and identity. Rice also transformed into drink. Fermented rice became the base for early rice wines, which were sipped during rituals and feasts. These drinks were not just for pleasure, but for connecting with the divine, as alcohol was believed to open channels between humans and spirits. A cup of rice wine, clear and faintly sweet, would be shared in ceremonies, binding people together in moments of celebration and reverence. But rice farming was not without hardship. Floods, droughts, and pests threatened crops. And because communities relied so heavily on rice, a bad harvest could bring famine. This vulnerability made rice precious. Every grain was valued, and wasting food was unthinkable. Families learned to stretch rice by mixing it with vegetables, herbs, or bits of meat, creating stews and porridges that filled stomachs and conserved resources. Even the water used to boil rice was saved and drunk, as it contained nutrients. This culture of respect for food is still seen today in Chinese traditions that frown upon leaving rice uneaten in a bowl. Cooking methods evolved alongside rice cultivation. The invention of pottery allowed rice to be steamed, producing fluffy textures that boiling alone could not achieve. Clay pots were used to make congee, a rice porridge that remains a staple comfort food in China to this day. Congee could be plain or enriched with vegetables, dried fish, or herbs, making it adaptable to both feast and famine. Its soothing, gentle nature made it especially valued for the sick or elderly, proving that food was also medicine. Over time, rice spread beyond the Yangtze Basin. As dynasties rose and fell, rice cultivation expanded, and its presence began to define the cultural divide between North and South. While the North remained loyal to wheat and millet, the South lived by rice. This divide influenced not only diets, but also regional identities, cooking styles, and even philosophies of life. The saying, "Southern rice, northern wheat," reflects a cultural truth that still resonates today. Rice's importance was so immense that it influenced language itself. In many Chinese dialects, the word for meal is synonymous with rice. To ask someone if they have eaten is essentially to ask if they have had rice. This linguistic connection illustrates just how central rice was to daily life, embedding itself not only in stomachs, but in minds and speech. We can imagine the daily rhythm of life shaped by rice. Dawn breaks, and farmers wade barefoot into flooded fields, their reflections shimmering in the water. They bend, plant, weed, and tend for hours under the sun. At midday, they gather under a tree to eat bowls of steamed rice, perhaps with a few vegetables or salted fish. In the evening, families share rice once more, the comfort of its warmth reminding them that, despite hardships, they are sustained. Day after day, generation after generation, this cycle repeated, and in that repetition lay both survival and culture. Rice was not glamorous food in ancient times, but it was essential. It nurtured children, sustained workers, and honored ancestors. It fueled armies, supported dynasties, and inspired rituals. Its presence in every home, from the humblest hut to the emperor's palace, gave it an almost sacred universality. Without rice, the story of ancient China would be incomplete, for rice was not just food, was the lifeblood of civilization. By the time the Han Dynasty flourished, rice had spread widely, and its role in Chinese culture was undeniable. Dishes became more elaborate, with rice paired alongside meats, vegetables, and sauces. Yet, at its heart, rice remained the same, a simple grain that connected body to spirit, past to present, and family to community. In the history of Chinese food, rice stands as both symbol and sustenance, the quiet yet powerful foundation upon which so much was built. Before rice became the celebrated staple of southern China, millet held pride of place in the diets of those who lived along the Yellow River. Millet is small, golden, and unassuming, yet it was the grain that fed generations of ancient Chinese families. Archaeological evidence suggests that millet cultivation began as early as 8000 BCE, making it one of the first domesticated crops in East Asia. To picture ancient meals, we must imagine steaming bowls of millet porridge, rough cakes baked from millet flour, and perhaps even early attempts at beer brewed from fermented millet. These grains were not merely food. They were resilience against hunger, the first shield against famine. Millet was well suited to the harsh northern climate, thriving in poor soils and enduring droughts that would devastate more delicate crops. Its toughness made it the lifeblood of early settlements. In villages that relied on millet, survival depended on careful storage and planning. Granaries filled with dried millet were symbols of security. A well-stocked storehouse meant that even in the cold months of winter, families could continue to eat. The rhythm of life was tied to planting and harvest, to grinding stones and cooking fires. The sound of pestles crushing millet into flour would have echoed through countless homes, a familiar daily music of survival. Alongside millet, sorghum also made its way into the diets of ancient Chinese people. Sorghum, with its tall stalks and red-brown grains, appeared somewhat later, but quickly became another vital crop. Like millet, it was hardy and adaptable, thriving where other grains might fail. Sorghum could be ground into flour, cooked into porridge, or even fermented into strong alcoholic drinks. Its arrival added diversity to the grain-based diet, giving farmers and families more options for nutrition and sustenance. These hardy grains shaped not only the diet, but also the agricultural identity of northern China. Eating in these early times was about survival more than flavor. Meals were plain and functional. Millet and sorghum were often boiled into gruel, a filling but bland dish. Occasionally, vegetables gathered from the wild or bits of meat from hunting would be added, but most days, meals were repetitive and humble. Yet within this simplicity lay strength. A bowl of millet porridge was enough to fuel a farmer through long hours of labor in the fields, or to keep a child nourished through harsh winters. Every grain mattered, and none could be wasted. Rituals and beliefs also surrounded these grains. Millet, in particular, held symbolic importance. Ancient Chinese texts and legends often mention millet as one of the 5 grains, revered for its role in sustaining life. Offerings of millet were placed on altars to honor ancestors and deities, a gesture of gratitude for survival itself. In these acts, we see how food was never merely practical. It was spiritual, a way to connect the struggles of daily life with the mysteries of the heavens. Millet also influenced early technologies. Grinding stones, mortar, and pestles became essential household tools. The process of preparing millet was labor-intensive, often requiring hours of grinding before it could be turned into flour or dough. This repetitive labor shaped daily routines, embedding the act of food preparation deeply into family life. Women often bore the responsibility for grinding and cooking, their work sustaining not only the household, but the community as well. The tools themselves became heirlooms of culture, carried from one generation to the next. The diversity of grains in ancient China also reflects the diversity of the land. While rice dominated the fertile south, the north relied on what it could grow in its harsher conditions. Sorghum and millet became symbols of northern resilience, embodying the ability to endure hardship and find nourishment where little else would grow. Even today, dishes made from millet are remembered as traditional in northern Chinese cuisine, a living memory of ancient survival. As communities expanded and trade networks grew, these grains began to circulate beyond their original regions. Millet and sorghum traveled along early routes, exchanged between farmers and traders, gradually shaping the diets of more distant settlements. This exchange not only diversified diets, but also fostered cultural connections. Food, once again, was both sustenance and a bridge between people. The storage of grains also spurred the development of social organization. Keeping millet and sorghum safe from pests, moisture, and theft required planning and cooperation. Villages built communal granaries, guarded and maintained with care. Those who controlled the granaries often wielded power, as access to food meant control over survival. In this way, millet and sorghum influenced not just the stomachs of ancient Chinese people, but also the politics of their communities. Over time, these humble grains gave way to greater culinary variety, but their legacy remained. They were the backbone upon which later cuisines could flourish. Without millet and sorghum, the stability needed for dynasties to rise might never have existed. They were the silent partners of civilization, less glamorous than rice or later delicacies, but essential in every sense. Imagine sitting in a small mud brick home thousands of years ago, the smell of porridge rising from a clay pot over the fire. A family gathers around, each holding a simple bowl, grateful for the warmth and sustenance it provides. Outside, the winds of winter howl, but inside, the grains grown months earlier ensure survival. It was in moments like these that Chinese civilization took root, nourished by the golden grains of millet and the hardy stalks of sorghum. Though often overlooked today, millet and sorghum deserve recognition as the grains that built the foundation of ancient China's food culture. Their story is one of endurance, resilience, and quiet importance. In every spoonful of porridge, in every offering placed upon an altar, these grains carried the weight of survival and the promise of continuity. They remind us that sometimes the most unassuming foods are the ones that shape entire civilizations. When most people think of Chinese culture, tea immediately comes to mind. But in ancient China, tea was not always the familiar warm beverage we know today. Its earliest use was far different, more medicinal than social, more bitter remedy than soothing drink. To imagine ancient Chinese food and drink, we must step back to a time when tea leaves were first discovered, not as part of a refined ceremony, but as wild plants gathered in the forests of the south. The story of tea's origin is woven with legend. One of the most famous tales credits Emperor Shen Nong, a mythical figure said to have ruled around 2700 BCE, with its discovery. According to legend, Shen Nong was boiling water under a tree when leaves from a wild tea bush drifted into the pot. Curious, he drank the infusion and found it both refreshing and invigorating. Whether the story is fact or folklore, it reflects how tea first entered human awareness, as a chance encounter with nature that gradually became central to daily life. Archaeological evidence suggests that tea was initially used not as a casual drink, but as a medicine. Early records and excavations reveal that leaves were chewed raw or boiled with herbs to create bitter concoctions, intended to cleanse the body or treat illness. Tea's natural caffeine content likely gave it a stimulating effect, sharpening focus and warding off fatigue. For farmers, laborers, or travelers, this would have been invaluable. Tea may not have been sweet or comforting in its earliest forms, but it offered vitality and health, qualities deeply prized in ancient cultures. The preparation of tea in its early days was vastly different from the steeping of loose leaves that we know today. Leaves were often pressed into cakes, dried, or mixed with other herbs. They might be boiled in soups or stews, adding a sharp, bitter edge that was believed to have healing properties. In some cases, tea was ground and mixed with grains like millet, creating a thick, nourishing mixture. This was far from the delicate cup of tea enjoyed in later dynasties, but it was food and medicine intertwined. Over time, tea's role began to shift. As techniques of drying, steaming, and brewing developed, the bitterness of raw leaves softened, and people began to drink tea for pleasure as well as health. By the time of the Han Dynasty, tea had become more widely consumed, though still not in the refined forms we might recognize. It was a rustic drink, associated with common people and monks, valued for its ability to refresh the body and clear the mind. The connection between tea and spirituality grew strong in ancient China. Monks, particularly in Buddhist monasteries, found tea invaluable in supporting long hours of meditation. Its stimulating effects kept drowsiness at bay, while its simplicity aligned with principles of discipline and mindfulness. Tea became not only a drink, but also a tool for spiritual practice, linking body and mind in quiet balance. From these early monastic settings, tea culture began to spread, slowly making its way into broader society. The gathering of tea was itself a cultural act. Families or small groups would venture into hills and forests, picking leaves from wild bushes. The activity required knowledge of which leaves were safe and when to harvest them. Early communities treated tea not as a commodity, but as part of the natural world, a gift to be respected and used wisely. This intimate relationship with the land would continue to shape Chinese tea culture for centuries. Imagine sitting in an ancient village, a pot bubbling over the fire. Instead of soup or porridge, it contains a brew of tea leaves, perhaps mixed with ginger, onions, or other herbs. The aroma is sharp, earthy, and somewhat bitter. A family sips the liquid slowly, not for relaxation, but for its perceived power to cleanse the body or strengthen the spirit. It is a far cry from the refined tea ceremonies of later centuries, but it represents the earliest stage of one of humanity's most enduring beverages. The symbolic role of tea also began to take root in these early centuries. While rice symbolized sustenance and continuity, tea came to embody clarity, purity, and balance. Even before elaborate rituals were established, the act of sharing tea carried meaning. To offer tea to a guest was to offer health, energy, and goodwill. This simple gesture laid the foundation for the deeply ritualized tea culture that would blossom in later dynasties. As dynasties rose and fell, tea followed its own journey of refinement. Techniques of steaming leaves were developed, methods of brewing evolved, and tea slowly moved from being a medicinal brew to a cultural cornerstone. But in these earliest times, it was simply another element of ancient Chinese food culture, a leaf from the forest, transformed by fire, and water into a drink that would one day conquer the world. Looking back, it is astonishing to consider how tea began, bitter, medicinal, and humble. Yet even then, its qualities were undeniable. It energized the body, sharpened the mind, and soothed the spirit. These qualities, discovered thousands of years ago, remain the same today, linking modern tea drinkers to the earliest farmers, monks, and villagers of ancient China. Tea before it was tea was raw, earthy, and unrefined, but in its simplicity lay the spark of something timeless. While grains such as rice and millet formed the foundation of ancient Chinese diets, vegetables provided color, flavor, and vital nourishment to meals. From the earliest days of farming along the Yellow and Yangtze Rivers, people learned to cultivate and gather a wide variety of greens, roots, and herbs. These plants not only sustained daily life, but also reflected the ingenuity of the people who turned humble ingredients into essential elements of their cuisine. To imagine ancient Chinese meals, we must picture not only bowls of grain, but also baskets of leafy greens, pungent onions, and earthy roots laid out in rustic kitchens. The earliest vegetables grown in China included soybeans, a crop that would become central not just as food, but as the basis of sauces, pastes, and even milk-like drinks in later centuries. Archaeological sites from the Zhou dynasty reveal traces of soybean cultivation, suggesting that they were boiled, roasted, or ground into meals that added both protein and variety to otherwise grain-heavy diets. Alongside soybeans, farmers grew radishes, cabbages, and turnips, hardy plants that could endure various climates and store well through the winter. These vegetables may not have seemed glamorous, but they offered crucial nutrition to families and workers alike. Leafy greens, often foraged in the wild, made frequent appearances in ancient diets. Amaranth leaves, mustard greens, and wild herbs would have been gathered from the fields and hillsides, boiled into soups or stir-fried in clay pots with bits of oil or animal fat. Their sharp or bitter flavors provided contrast to the blandness of porridge and rice, while their vitamins kept communities healthier. Garlic and onions were also widely used, not only for taste, but also for their believed medicinal properties. The sharp bite of garlic added depth to simple dishes, while its reputation for warding off illness made it doubly valuable. Roots were especially important. Taro, yams, and lotus roots grew in abundance, particularly in southern regions where wetlands made such crops thrive. These roots could be roasted, boiled, or stewed, offering a hearty, filling alternative when grain supplies ran low. Lotus root, with its crisp texture and delicate flavor, became both a staple food and a symbolic ingredient in rituals, embodying purity and connection to the natural world. Farmers learned to use not only the roots, but also the leaves and seeds, ensuring that no part of the plant went to waste. Vegetables also reflected the Chinese philosophy of balance in food. Meals were not simply about filling the stomach, but about harmonizing the body. The bitter taste of greens balanced the sweetness of grains or fruits, while pungent onions complemented the richness of meat. Early Chinese medicine taught that foods carried energies cooling, warming, dampening, or drying, and vegetables often played a key role in balancing these elements. A bowl of hot porridge might be accompanied by cooling cucumber or bitter greens to restore equilibrium, a practice that foreshadowed the sophisticated food as medicine philosophy that would flourish in later centuries. Cooking methods for vegetables were simple but effective. Clay pots and bronze vessels allowed boiling, steaming, and slow cooking. Soups were especially common, as they stretched ingredients further and provided hydration. A pot might hold rice, radish, garlic, and wild greens all simmering together, creating a meal that was both filling and restorative. In wealthier households or during feasts, vegetables might be combined with meats or flavored with fermented pastes, but in most villages, they remained humble fare, eaten daily and appreciated for their reliability. Seasonality shaped vegetable use. In spring, tender shoots and leaves were gathered. In summer, cucumbers and melons offered cooling relief. Autumn brought turnips, cabbages, and beans, while winter meals leaned heavily on preserved or stored roots. Pickling became a crucial practice, allowing cabbages or radishes to last through the cold months. The tang of pickled vegetables not only preserved food, but also introduced variety to winter diets, preventing monotony when fresh greens were scarce. This innovation would continue through centuries, evolving into the rich pickling traditions that remain part of Chinese cuisine today. Vegetables also held ritual significance. Offerings of greens or roots were made to ancestors, symbolizing the bounty of the earth and the continuity of life. Certain vegetables carried symbolic meanings. Leeks, for example, were associated with abundance, while garlic could signify strength. These associations demonstrate how deeply food was intertwined with both daily survival and cultural belief. Eating vegetables was not just nourishment, but participation in a wider web of meaning that bound people to the land and to their ancestors. Imagine an ancient family meal, bowls of millet porridge set out on a wooden table, accompanied by plates of boiled greens and pickled radish. The flavors are sharp and earthy, the textures simple, but together they form a complete and nourishing diet. In wealthier households, perhaps a clay pot simmers with taro root, soybeans, and garlic, a stew that fills the air with savory aroma. In both humble and grand settings, vegetables grounded the meal, tying people to the cycles of nature and the rhythms of the earth. The role of vegetables in ancient Chinese food cannot be overstated. They were the bridge between survival and flavor, between health and pleasure. They added variety to grain-heavy meals, offered medicinal benefits, and carried symbolic meaning in rituals and traditions. Without vegetables, ancient diets would have been monotonous and nutritionally deficient. But with them, meals became balanced, meaningful, and enduring. These humble plants, grown in fields or gathered from the wild, gave ancient China its first taste of variety, setting the stage for the rich and diverse cuisine that would follow. In the quiet orchards and wild groves of ancient China, fruits provided bursts of sweetness and refreshment that contrasted with the hearty grains and earthy vegetables of daily life. While not eaten in the same abundance as rice or millet, fruits were treasured for their flavor, nourishment, and symbolic meaning. To picture the food of ancient China, we must imagine baskets of peaches ripening in the sun, clusters of wild grapes twined along riverbanks, and fragrant plums hanging heavy on their branches, waiting for harvest. Peaches are among the most iconic fruits of ancient China, both for their taste and their place in mythology. They were believed to embody immortality, their blossoms celebrated in poems, and their fruit offered at festivals and rituals. Ancient farmers cultivated peach trees in the fertile valleys along the Yellow and Yangtze Rivers, where the climate allowed them to flourish. Eaten fresh in summer, dried for winter, or fermented into wine, peaches carried both sweetness and symbolism. To eat a peach was not just to enjoy fruit, it was to taste a piece of eternity, a belief that echoes through centuries of Chinese lore. Plums were another essential fruit, known for their tartness and versatility. Ancient households used plums fresh, dried them for storage, or cooked them into sauces that flavored otherwise plain dishes. Plums were also steeped into drinks, their sharpness creating refreshing infusions. Symbolically, the plum tree became a powerful image of resilience, as it blossomed in late winter, defying the cold and promising spring. In this way, the fruit was not only food, but also metaphor, embodying endurance and hope in the face of hardship. Mulberries, closely linked with the silkworm industry, were both practical and nourishing. While mulberry leaves fed silkworms that would give rise to China's legendary silk, the berries themselves were eaten fresh or dried. Sweet and slightly tart, mulberries provided a valuable source of sugar in a diet otherwise low in sweetness. Their cultivation tied together food, economy, and luxury, since silk would become one of China's greatest exports. Thus, a simple fruit like the mulberry had ripples of influence reaching far beyond the dinner table. Persimmons also entered the ancient diet, especially in southern regions where the climate favored their growth. When ripe, their soft flesh offered a honey-like sweetness, while dried persimmons became chewy, long-lasting treats. In some traditions, persimmons symbolized transformation, as their harsh astringency when unripe gave way to sweetness when matured. For ancient farmers and families, persimmons represented patience, the reward of waiting for nature's time. Wild fruits, too, played a role. Grapes grew in certain regions, though widespread cultivation came later through contact with Central Asia via the Silk Road. In earlier centuries, wild grapes were gathered, their juice sometimes fermented into primitive wines. Berries, melons, and wild figs may also have been part of seasonal diets, foraged from fields and forests. These fruits were not everyday staples, but occasional delights, enjoyed during their brief seasons and remembered fondly in their absence. The symbolic meaning of fruits was as important as their taste. In rituals, fruits often represented abundance, continuity, and prosperity. Offering peaches or plums to ancestors was a way of sharing the sweetness of life across generations. Festivals featured fruits as well, their presence marking seasonal change and communal joy. Even in ancient times, food was not only for nourishment, but also for celebration, and fruits, with their vibrant colors and natural sweetness, were perfect emblems of festivity. Preservation methods allowed fruits to stretch beyond their natural seasons. Drying was the most common technique, with peaches, plums, and persimmons laid out in the sun until their moisture was gone. Dried fruits could be stored for months, providing sweetness in winter when fresh produce was scarce. Some fruits were also pickled, their flavors transformed into tangy accompaniments for grain-based meals. These preservation techniques ensured that the enjoyment of fruit was not limited to harvest time, but could brighten meals throughout the year. Imagine a summer day in ancient China, a child plucking a ripe peach from a low branch, juice running down their chin as they bite into the soft flesh. Nearby, farmers gather baskets of plums, their sharp tang destined for sauces and pickling jars. Mulberries are shaken from branches, staining fingers purple as they are eaten on the spot. These moments capture the joy of fruit, a joy that broke the monotony of daily porridge and stews with sweetness from the earth. Fruits also played a role in early medicine. According to ancient beliefs, each fruit carried properties that could influence health. Peaches were thought to strengthen vitality, plums to aid digestion, and mulberries to cool the body in summer heat. Persimmons were believed to soothe the throat. Thus, fruits were not indulgences alone, but practical remedies. Part of the philosophy that food and medicine were deeply intertwined. Though not as central as rice or millet, fruits gave ancient Chinese food culture its dimension of delight and symbolism. They were seasonal treasures, rich in meaning, flavor, and health. Their role in rituals, festivals, and medicine made them more than mere food. They were carriers of story, hope, and joy. To taste fruit in ancient China was to taste the sweetness of life itself, fleeting but unforgettable, just like the blossoms that promised their return each year. Though grains and vegetables formed the backbone of ancient Chinese diets, meat was a prized addition, valued both for its flavor and for the status it conferred. In the earliest dynasties, meat was not eaten daily by ordinary families. Instead, it appeared occasionally, often reserved for feasts, rituals, or wealthier households. To picture the food of ancient China, You must imagine meals where porridge or rice formed the base, while small portions of pork, beef, or wild game were added sparingly, transforming humble dishes into moments of celebration. The earliest domesticated animals in China included pigs, which were among the most important sources of meat. Pigs were easy to raise, adaptable to scraps and leftovers, and prolific breeders. Archaeological evidence from Neolithic sites shows pig bones in abundance, suggesting that pork became the primary meat in many communities. Pork could be boiled, roasted, or stewed, though in early times the preparation was simple, often involving only salt or basic herbs. Even so, pork was considered highly desirable, and its presence at a meal signified comfort and prosperity. Dogs were also domesticated early in Chinese history, and while they were valued as hunting companions, they were sometimes eaten as well. Ancient texts refer to dog meat being consumed, particularly during rituals or in certain regions. Chickens, too, were present, offering both meat and eggs, though their role in diets was modest compared to later times. Sheep and goats were herded in northern areas, providing not only meat, but also milk and wool. Cattle, though essential as draft animals, were less commonly eaten, as their labor in the fields was often too valuable to sacrifice for the table. Hunting provided another crucial source of meat, especially in early dynasties before animal domestication was widespread. The forests and plains of ancient China were home to deer, boars, rabbits, and birds, all of which were pursued with bows, traps, and spears. Hunting was both sustenance and sport, a skill that reflected both survival and status. Nobles in particular made hunting a central activity, using it not only to gather food, but also to demonstrate power and prowess. The meat obtained from hunts was often shared at feasts, linking the act of hunting with social and political authority. Fishing also supplemented meat consumption, with rivers and lakes providing an abundance of freshwater species. Carp, catfish, and eels were caught using nets, hooks, or woven traps. These fish were boiled, grilled, or dried for storage, offering protein in areas where livestock was less abundant. In southern regions closer to the sea, shellfish and saltwater fish added further variety to the diet, though fishing practices remained largely local and small-scale in the earliest centuries. Meat carried symbolic and ritual importance as well. In many ancient ceremonies, animals were sacrificed to honor ancestors or deities, and the meat was then consumed as part of the ritual feast. Pigs, sheep, and oxen were among the animals most frequently offered, their flesh believed to bridge the human and spiritual worlds. To eat meat in these contexts was to partake in something sacred, a sharing of sustenance between the living and the divine. This ritualistic use of meat underscored its value, elevating it beyond mere nutrition into the realm of culture and belief. The scarcity of meat for ordinary families made it especially treasured. A small piece of pork, added to a pot of vegetables, transformed the entire dish, infusing it with richness that grains alone could not provide. Bones might be boiled to create broths, stretching their flavor into soups that nourished many mouths. Nothing was wasted, for meat was too precious to be consumed carelessly. This resourcefulness reflected both necessity and respect for the life taken to provide food. Cooking methods for meat evolved with technology. Early bronze vessels allowed boiling and stewing, while clay ovens in pits enabled roasting. Stews combining meat with grains and vegetables became common, the flavors melding into hearty, sustaining meals. In wealthier households, spices and fermented sauces might be added, but in most homes, meat remained simple fare, its natural flavors appreciated without elaborate preparation. This simplicity highlighted the contrast between ordinary diets and the elaborate banquets of nobility. Imagine a small family gathered in a village hut. A clay pot simmers over the fire, filled mostly with millet and greens, but with a few chunks of pork floating among the grains. The aroma fills the room, and when the family eats, the meat is savored, each bite shared with gratitude. For them, this was not an everyday meal, but a special moment, a reminder of abundance in a life often marked by scarcity. Meanwhile, in the court of a nobleman, whole animals might roast on spits, surrounded by musicians and attendants, the feast a display of power and wealth. Across these extremes, meat carried meaning that went far beyond its taste. The importance of meat in ancient China lies not in its abundance, but in its rarity. It was a marker of prosperity, a ritual offering, and a symbol of survival. Hunting and domestication gradually provided more access, but even then, meat remained something to be valued, respected, and shared. In the story of ancient Chinese food, meat was never the foundation. It was the embellishment, the luxury, the taste that turned survival into celebration. And in that role, it shaped both the table and the culture of early dynasties, leaving a legacy that endures in the flavors and traditions of China today. If the land gave ancient China its grains and vegetables, the waters provided its hidden treasures. Rivers, lakes, and coastal seas were abundant with fish and shellfish, offering nourishment that complemented the grain-heavy diet of early farmers. To picture ancient Chinese meals fully, we must imagine the shimmer of carp pulled from the Yellow River, baskets of eels wriggling on riverbanks, and shellfish gathered from tidal flats along the southern coast. Fish was more than just food. It was sustenance, symbolism, and survival. The Yellow River and the Yangtze River, two lifelines of ancient Chinese civilization, teemed with freshwater fish. Carp, catfish, perch, and eels were among the most common catches. Carp, in particular, held special cultural significance. It was admired for its strength and perseverance, and legends told of carp that could leap over the dragon gate and transform into dragons. This made carp not only a meal, but also a symbol of ambition and success. Families ate carp not just for its nourishment, but for its story, believing that the fish embodied hope and transformation. Fishing methods in ancient times were practical and varied. Nets woven from hemp fibers were cast into rivers, while woven baskets and traps were set in shallow waters. Hooks made from bone or bronze lured fish with bits of grain or insects. In some areas, entire communities worked together, driving fish into shallow nets or constructing weirs to guide them into enclosures. These techniques reflected ingenuity, cooperation, and an intimate knowledge of local waterways. Fishing was not simply a solitary act, but often a communal one, tying families and neighbors together in shared effort and shared meals. Beyond rivers, lakes offered another source of fish. The Great Lakes of central and southern China supported communities that relied heavily on fishing. Fish from these waters were boiled into soups, roasted over open flames, or dried for storage. Dried fish was particularly valuable, as it allowed protein to last through winter months or long journeys. In coastal regions, people harvested shellfish such as clams, oysters, and mussels, supplementing their diets with the rich bounty of the sea. Seaweed was also collected, used both as food and as medicine, its salty tang adding variety to meals. Fish was prepared in ways that highlighted simplicity and nourishment. Boiling was the most common method, producing broths that combined fish with grains or vegetables. These soups were both filling and restorative, easy to digest and comforting in harsh winters. In wealthier households, fish might be steamed or roasted with herbs, while fermented sauces enhanced its flavor. Pickling was another method, ensuring that fish could be preserved for long periods. Each preparation method reflected a balance of necessity and creativity, turning the unpredictable gift of the rivers into reliable meals. Symbolically, fish held powerful meanings in ancient China. The word for fish, yu, was a homophone for abundance, making it a symbol of prosperity and plenty. Serving fish at feasts or rituals represented wishes for surplus and success. Paintings, carvings, and ornaments featuring fish emphasized these associations. embedding the creature not only in diets, but in art, belief, and tradition. To eat fish was to partake in abundance itself, a reminder that food was both material and spiritual sustenance. Fishing was also tied to social status. For peasants, catching fish was often a matter of survival, a way to supplement diets when grain supplies were meager. For nobles and rulers, fish could be a delicacy, prepared with care and displayed at banquets as a sign of wealth and refinement. The same carp that fed villagers by the river might appear on a lacquered dish in a palace hall, transformed by context from common food into luxury. This duality highlights how food could bridge social divides while also reinforcing them. Imagine an ancient village at dawn. Fishermen push small boats into the misty river, their nets coiled and ready. Hours later, they return with baskets of wriggling carp and catfish. Families gather, and soon clay pots bubble with fish soup, the aroma mingling with smoke from the hearth. Children slurp the broth, while elders chew carefully on the tender flesh. Meanwhile, in the grand halls of a noble estate, fish is steamed with fragrant herbs, presented on elaborate platters to honored guests. Both meals share the same ingredient, yet they speak to different worlds, bound together by the common thread of water's bounty. Fish also linked humans to the divine. In some rituals, fish were offered to ancestors or deities, symbols of abundance carried from river to altar. The act of giving fish as sacrifice expressed gratitude for the natural world as generosity and sought blessings for future harvests. In this way, the fish that sustained life also bridged mortal and spiritual realms, becoming part of the rhythm of belief and tradition. The significance of fish in ancient China lies not only in their role as food, but in the broader meanings they carried. They sustained villages, enriched festivals, adorned rituals, and symbolized abundance. From rivers and lakes to seas and shores, fish connected people to the waters that shaped their lives. In the quiet splash of a net, the simmer of a clay pot, or the gleam of a carp leaping from a river, we see how fish were woven into the very fabric of ancient Chinese food culture, both as nourishment for the body and as symbols of prosperity for the spirit. Among the many contributions of ancient China to world food culture, few are as transformative as the art of fermentation. Long before refrigerators or modern preservation, ancient Chinese people discovered that grains, beans, and vegetables could be transformed through time, salt, and natural processes into foods that were not only preserved, but also deeply flavorful. Fermentation gave birth to products that remain essential today, none more famous than soy sauce. To understand ancient Chinese food, we must step into the kitchens and storerooms where clay jars quietly bubbled with life, producing tastes unlike anything else. The roots of fermentation in China stretch back thousands of years. Archaeological discoveries have uncovered vessels with traces of fermented grain-based alcohol dating back to around 7000 BCE. This shows that even in the earliest farming communities, people were experimenting with fermentation, likely stumbling upon it accidentally when grains or beans left in damp conditions transformed into new substances. What began as accident became tradition, and tradition became a cornerstone of Chinese cuisine. Soybeans played a central role in this story. By the time of the Zhou dynasty, soybeans were widely cultivated, valued not only for their protein, but also for their versatility. When boiled alone, soybeans were nourishing but plain. But when salted and left to ferment in jars, they broke down into savory pastes and liquids that revolutionized cooking. These early soybean ferments were the ancestors of soy sauce, one of the most influential condiments in history. Imagine a clay jar buried in the ground, its lid sealed with straw, inside which beans slowly softened, their flavors deepening over months under the watch of patient farmers and cooks. Fermented soybean paste, known in various forms, was among the first results of this process. Thick and salty, it could be added to porridges, soups, or stews, enriching their flavor with a depth otherwise missing from grain-heavy diets. Over time, Liquid byproducts of these pastes, dark, salty, and aromatic, were collected, refined, and eventually became what we now recognize as soy sauce. To ancient palates accustomed to the blandness of millet or rice, the addition of fermented sauces was a revelation, turning ordinary meals into extraordinary experiences. Fermentation was not limited to soybeans. Vegetables such as cabbages, radishes, and cucumbers were salted and left to ferment, creating tangy, long-lasting pickles that added brightness to winter diets. Fish was sometimes preserved in similar ways, buried in salt to draw out moisture and ferment into pungent pastes. Even grains could be fermented, producing both alcoholic drinks and savory seasonings. These practices extended the shelf life of food, protected against famine, and diversified diets in ways that transformed how people experienced meals. The philosophy behind fermentation reflected a broader worldview. Ancient Chinese thought emphasized balance, the harmony of yin and yang, the interplay of opposites. Fermentation itself was a process of transformation, of decay turning into nourishment, of time and patience unlocking hidden flavors. To eat fermented food was to partake in this philosophy, embracing the idea that life itself was shaped by cycles of change. In this way, soy sauce and other ferments were not merely condiments, but embodiments of cultural values. The preparation of fermented foods required care and knowledge. Clay jars were washed, dried, and packed with beans or vegetables, layered with salt, and sometimes mixed with grains or herbs. The jars were sealed and left in warm, dry places where natural microbes worked their quiet magic. Weeks or months later, the contents had transformed, and families opened the jars to reveal sauces or pastes far removed from the raw ingredients. This slow alchemy of fermentation required trust in nature and patience, virtues that shaped both the food and the people who made it. In daily meals, fermented products became indispensable. A spoonful of soybean paste could flavor an entire pot of porridge. Soy sauce, once it developed, became a universal seasoning, enhancing meats, vegetables, and grains alike. Pickled vegetables brought sourness and crunch to otherwise soft meals, stimulating the palate and aiding digestion. Even small amounts of these fermented foods elevated diets, adding variety, preservation, and nutrition in one stroke. Fermentation also played a role in medicine. Ancient Chinese physicians believed that fermented foods aided digestion, balanced internal energies, and even improved mood. Soybeans themselves were considered nourishing, but when fermented, their qualities were thought to become more potent, transforming them into tools of healing. This belief reinforced the link between food and medicine, a principle central to Chinese culture that continues to this day. Imagine a humble meal in an ancient household, a clay pot of millet porridge simmering on the hearth. Beside it, a small dish of fermented soybean paste waits to be stirred in, its salty aroma filling the room. Another dish holds pickled radishes, their sour crunch ready to cut through the porridge's heaviness. A few drops of early soy sauce, dark and rich, are drizzled over a piece of boiled pork, turning it into something far greater than the sum of its parts. These small additions transformed the meal, making it nourishing not only for the body, but for the spirit. In wealthier settings, fermented foods also played a part in feasts. Large jars of pickles accompanied banquets, and fermented sauces flavored elaborate dishes. Rice wine, another product of fermentation, was poured for guests, adding to the celebratory atmosphere. Thus, fermentation was present at both the humblest hearth and the grandest hall, binding together the social spectrum with its shared flavors. The birth of soy sauce and other fermented foods was one of ancient China's greatest culinary achievements. These creations outlived dynasties, spread across cultures, and continue to season meals worldwide. They reflect not only ingenuity, but also patience, respect for nature, and the belief that transformation is at the heart of life itself. In the story of ancient Chinese food, Fermentation was the quiet revolution that gave meals their soul, and soy sauce was its lasting gift to the world. To truly imagine what food looked like in ancient China, we must not only picture the ingredients, but also the vessels that transformed them into meals. Cooking was shaped by the tools people used, and in ancient China, those tools were both practical and symbolic. From simple clay pots used by villagers to elaborate bronze cauldrons displayed at royal banquets, the vessels of ancient China tell us how people prepared their food, how they shared it, and what it meant to them. The earliest cooking vessels were clay pots, shaped by hand and hardened in open fires. These pots were versatile, allowing people to boil grains into porridge, stew vegetables, or cook meat slowly over the hearth. Clay pots held heat well, and their rounded shapes made them ideal for simmering foods for long hours. The flavors of millet, soybeans, or fish blended together in these vessels, creating hearty, nourishing meals. For the majority of families, clay pots were the central tools of daily cooking, humble yet indispensable. As technology advanced, bronze vessels emerged, marking a turning point in both cuisine and culture. During the Shang dynasty, around 1600 to 1046 BCE, bronze was used not only for weapons and ritual items, but also for cooking and serving food. The most iconic of these were the ding, large tripod cauldrons with two handles, often elaborately decorated with animal motifs and geometric designs. These cauldrons were used to boil, stew, and sometimes steam food, but their significance extended far beyond the kitchen. To own a bronze ding was to hold power, as these vessels were symbols of authority, often buried with kings or used in ancestor rituals. Food cooked in such cauldrons was not just sustenance, but an offering, a link between the living and the spiritual realm. Other bronze vessels included the gui, used for holding grains, the chia, a tripod vessel for warming wine, and the yu, a container for storing liquids. Each vessel had its purpose, and together they created a system of cooking and serving that reflected both practical needs and ceremonial values. A feast in a noble household might include dishes prepared in bronze cauldrons, wine poured from intricately cast vessels, and grains served from decorated containers. These objects elevated food into a performance of wealth, culture, and ritual significance. For ordinary families, however, clay remained the material of choice. Clay stoves became more common, allowing more controlled cooking than open fires. Some households used clay steamers, early versions of the bamboo steamers still seen in Chinese kitchens today. The practice of steaming allowed grains and vegetables to be cooked gently, preserving flavor and texture. These innovations show that even in ancient times, Chinese cooks were experimenting with techniques that would define their cuisine for millennia. The development of cooking vessels also shaped flavor. Food simmered in clay pots absorbed earthy notes, while bronze cauldrons imparted a metallic sharpness. Over generations, families came to appreciate these subtle differences, and cooking traditions grew around them. Meals were not just about ingredients, but about the vessel that held them, linking taste to technology and culture. Beyond practicality, vessels were deeply tied to social identity. In rural villages, a single clay pot might serve an entire family for years, passed down as a treasured object. Its blackened surface told the story of countless meals, its cracks repaired with care. In noble households, bronze vessels displayed status, their elaborate patterns proclaiming wealth and lineage. To cook in bronze was to cook with history itself, to connect one's meal to ancestors and authority. The symbolism of cooking vessels appears in ancient texts as well. The possession of bronze ding cauldrons was said to signify the mandate of heaven, the divine approval of a ruler's authority. Thus, the right to cook and serve food in certain vessels was tied directly to power. Food preparation was not merely domestic labor. It was political, spiritual, and cultural expression. Imagine an ancient scene. In a village, a family gathers around a clay stove. Millet porridge bubbles gently in a pot, steam rising into the cool morning air. Children wait eagerly as their mother stirs the porridge with a wooden ladle, the sound of boiling grain filling the room. Meanwhile, in a royal court, attendants lift heavy bronze cauldrons, their surfaces shining with carved dragons. Inside, meats and grains stew together, prepared for a ritual feast that will honor ancestors and display the king's power. Both meals are about survival, but one speaks of simplicity and the other of spectacle. Cooking vessels also shaped community gatherings. Large cauldrons allowed food to be cooked in bulk, supporting festivals, ceremonies, and communal feasts. In these contexts, food became a collective experience, shared among many and tied to memory, identity, and tradition. The vessel was the centerpiece, not just a container, but a symbol of togetherness. The story of ancient Chinese cooking vessels is the story of how technology and culture meet at the hearth. Clay pots nourished families with daily meals, while bronze cauldrons proclaimed authority and reverence. Together, they framed the experience of food, reminding us that what we eat is inseparable from how we prepare it. In their humble and grand forms alike, these vessels carried the flavors, meanings, and identities of ancient China, leaving behind not only artifacts for archaeologists, but also traditions that continue in kitchens today. By the time of the Han Dynasty, 206 BCE to 220 CE, Chinese cuisine had grown far beyond the humble porridge and stews of the earliest farmers. The empire's expansion, prosperity, and connection to the Silk Road introduced new ingredients, techniques, and a culture of feasting that reflected both wealth and hierarchy. To understand what food looked like in ancient China at this time, we must imagine grand banquets filled with dozens of dishes, servants carrying trays of meats and vegetables, and tables set not just for nourishment, but for spectacle, politics, and ritual. The Han Dynasty marked a turning point in the scale and sophistication of food. While ordinary peasants still relied on rice, millet, and vegetables for their daily meals, the nobility and imperial court indulged in elaborate spreads. Banquets were opportunities to display wealth, power, and refinement, and no detail was too small. The food itself was only part of the performance. Music, poetry, and ritual accompanied the meals, turning dining into an event that affirmed the authority of the host and the prosperity of the empire. The dishes at these banquets were diverse and creative. Meats were abundant, including pork, beef, lamb, venison, and poultry, often roasted, stewed, or braised with fermented sauces and herbs. Fish and shellfish, brought in from rivers and coastal regions, added variety and luxury. Vegetables such as garlic, onions, radishes, and cabbage were stewed or stir-fried, often seasoned with early soy sauce, vinegar, or aromatic herbs. Grains were served not only as porridges and breads, but also in more refined forms, shaped into cakes, or used to make noodles. For dessert, fruits like peaches, plums, and persimmons were offered fresh or dried, alongside sweets made from honey or malt syrup. Alcohol played a central role in Han banquets. Rice wine, often brewed with herbs, was poured generously, and drinking games and toasts accompanied the feast. Wine cups passed from guest to guest, and the rhythm of drinking shaped the flow of conversation and ritual. To refuse a cup was often considered impolite, and the ability to drink in harmony with others was a sign of refinement and sociability. Wine was not only a drink, but also a social glue, binding participants in shared joy and camaraderie. Banquets were also stages for political theater. To be invited to dine with an emperor or high-ranking official was an honor, a sign of favor that could elevate one's status. Conversely, to be excluded was a mark of disgrace. Food in these settings was thus both a reward and a weapon, a tool of power wielded as skillfully as any law or decree. The emperor's table symbolized the abundance of the empire itself, and partaking in it was partaking in the prosperity and legitimacy of the dynasty. The logistics of these feasts were immense. Cooks, servants, and attendants worked tirelessly to prepare and serve the food. Kitchens in wealthy households could employ dozens of people, each specializing in a particular task: butchering animals, fermenting sauces, brewing wine, or preparing vegetables. Bronze and clay vessels were used to cook and serve, their ornate designs adding to the spectacle. The sheer variety of dishes reflected not only the resources of the host, but also the empire's ability to gather food from across vast territories. Despite their extravagance, Han banquets were rooted in cultural values. Confucian ideals emphasized harmony, order, and ritual in all aspects of life, including dining. Seating arrangements, the order of dishes, and the rituals of toasting and serving were all carefully prescribed. Banquets reinforced social hierarchies, with each participant seated and served according to their rank. The food itself symbolized the harmony of the universe. Grains from the earth, fish from the waters, fruits from the trees, and wine from the labor of men. Each dish was part of a larger whole, a reflection of cosmic balance. For the common people, such banquets were distant dreams, but festivals and communal gatherings offered glimpses of abundance. During major celebrations, villagers might gather to share roasted meats, drink homemade wine, and enjoy performances. Though less elaborate than imperial feasts, these gatherings carried the same spirit of joy, community, and reverence for food as a symbol of life's fullness. In this way, the culture of banqueting extended across social classes, linking the farmer's hearth to the emperor's hall. Imagine a grand hall during the Han Dynasty. Long tables are laden with dishes, steaming pork stews, roasted duck, platters of fish glistening with sauce, bowls of fragrant vegetables, and trays of honeyed fruits. Musicians play in the background, their melodies mingling with the chatter of guests and the clinking of wine cups. Servants move gracefully, refilling cups and placing new dishes before the diners. At the head of the table, the emperor raises his cup, and the hall falls silent as he toasts to the prosperity of the realm. In that moment, food is not only sustenance, but also spectacle, symbol, and shared experience. The banquets of the Han Dynasty illustrate how food had become more than survival. It was culture, politics, and art. Meals were opportunities to reinforce power, celebrate abundance, and express values of harmony and ritual. While the daily meals of most people remained modest, the banquets of the elite shaped the image of Chinese food as something capable of both nourishing and dazzling. They remind us that food in ancient China was never just about eating. It was about meaning, connection, and the grand performance of life itself. By the height of the Han Dynasty, China was no longer a world unto itself. Trade routes stretched across deserts and mountains, linking the empire to distant lands in Central Asia, India, Persia, and eventually Rome. These trade routes, later called the Silk Road, carried not only silk and precious goods, but also ideas, technologies, and most importantly for our story flavors. The arrival of foreign spices and foods transformed ancient Chinese cuisine, adding layers of taste and complexity that local ingredients alone could not provide. Before the Silk Road, Chinese diets were rooted in what the land and rivers provided: rice, millet, vegetables, soy products, pork, fish, and local herbs. These foods formed a cuisine of balance and simplicity. But contact with traders introduced exotic items that startled and delighted the palate. Among these were black pepper from India, sesame seeds from Central Asia, and pomegranates and grapes from Persia. Suddenly, meals in China could include not only the familiar flavors of garlic, ginger, and fermented soy, but also the sharp heat of pepper, the nutty richness of sesame, and the sweet tart juiciness of new fruits. Spices were especially transformative. Pepper, with its pungent heat, changed the way meat was seasoned and preserved. Cinnamon and cardamom, though less common, began to appear in cooking and medicine, their aromas foreign but intriguing. These spices were costly, carried across dangerous deserts and mountain passes, and their presence at a feast signaled wealth and connection to the wider world. For the Chinese elite, serving dishes flavored with foreign spices was a way to demonstrate not only refinement, but also the empire's reach and influence. Grapes were among the most celebrated imports. Though wild grapes had existed in China, the larger, sweeter varieties brought from Persia became highly prized. They were eaten fresh, dried into raisins, or fermented into wine. Grape wine, distinct from traditional rice wine, introduced new drinking customs that fascinated the elite. Pomegranates also captured imaginations, their jeweled seeds symbolizing fertility and abundance. These fruits became not only foods, but also symbols in art, poetry, and ritual, their exotic origins adding to their allure. Sesame, introduced from Central Asia, found a natural place in Chinese cooking. Its seeds were ground into pastes, pressed into oil, or sprinkled over dishes, adding richness to both sweet and savory foods. Sesame oil in particular became valued for its ability to enhance flavors, lending depth to vegetables, meats, and breads. Over time, it integrated so seamlessly into Chinese cuisine that its foreign origins were all but forgotten, a reminder of how trade blurred the lines between local and imported. The Silk Road also influenced how food was perceived. The arrival of foreign goods sparked curiosity and experimentation, encouraging Chinese cooks to blend new flavors with traditional ones. Dishes became more varied and palates more adventurous. The blending of sesame with soy, of pepper with pork, of grapes with honey, created a cuisine that was both deeply rooted in Chinese tradition and open to the world. This openness reflected the spirit of the Han Dynasty itself, confident in its identity, yet eager to absorb what the wider world had to offer. Food from the Silk Road was not for everyone. The high cost of transport made these imports luxuries, affordable only to the wealthy and powerful. For common farmers, diets remained centered on grains and vegetables, with little exposure to foreign spices. But even so, the influence of the Silk Road trickled down over time. Techniques of preservation, new varieties of crops, and the cultural prestige of exotic foods gradually reshaped the broader food culture. What began as luxuries became, over centuries, familiar parts of the Chinese table. The symbolism of Silk Road foods was powerful. Grapes and wine became associated with abundance and joy, often appearing in celebrations and poetry. Pomegranates symbolized fertility, their many seeds representing generations to come. Sesame seeds, small yet plentiful, carried connotations of prosperity and endless potential. Each foreign food was not only a flavor, but also a story, an idea carried across continents and rooted in Chinese soil. Imagine a Han Dynasty banquet where these new flavors appear for the first time. Guests marvel at dishes sprinkled with pepper, their tongues tingling from the unfamiliar heat. They sip grape wine, its sharpness contrasting with the mellow sweetness of rice wine. They taste sesame oil drizzled over roasted meats, its nutty aroma lingering long after the last bite. These moments of discovery transformed meals into cultural encounters, reminders that food is always a bridge between worlds. The Silk Road did more than carry goods. It carried imagination. Foods and flavors that once seemed distant became part of Chinese identity, enriching the cuisine and expanding its possibilities. Ancient China's openness to these influences speaks to a universal truth. Food is never static. It evolves, absorbs, and transforms, carrying with it the history of encounters, exchanges, and shared humanity. In the case of China, the Silk Road ensured that its food culture was not only ancient and enduring, but also dynamic, global, and endlessly creative. Though imperial banquets and noble feasts capture much of the imagination, the true heartbeat of ancient Chinese food culture could often be found in the streets of its bustling cities. Markets, stalls, and street vendors offered quick, affordable, and flavorful foods to travelers, laborers, and common townsfolk. To understand what people really ate day to day, we must walk through the crowded avenues of Chang'an or Luoyang, past rows of wooden stalls and smoky braziers, where the scents of grilling meat, steaming dumplings, and bubbling broths filled the air. Street food had its origins in necessity. Farmers and merchants arriving in the city needed meals that were fast, cheap, and filling. Vendors answered this need by preparing dishes that could be eaten on the go or purchased in small portions. Millet porridge ladled into clay bowls, skewers of roasted meat sprinkled with salt and herbs, and flatbreads baked on hot stones were among the staples. These foods were simple but satisfying, providing energy for the day's work or trade. For many, street food was more than convenience. It was survival in a crowded, fast-paced world. One of the most popular offerings was dumplings, which may have originated as simple pockets of dough filled with meat, vegetables, or beans. Boiled in water or steamed over pots, these dumplings were easy to prepare in bulk and could be sold quickly to hungry customers. Their portability made them ideal street food, and their variety kept customers returning. A traveler might eat dumplings filled with pork in one stall and dumplings with cabbage and garlic in another, savoring the diversity within a familiar form. Noodles also became increasingly common, especially in northern China, where wheat was abundant. Street vendors stretched dough into long strands, boiled them in large pots, and served them in steaming bowls of broth. Toppings varied from simple greens to slices of meat, with fermented sauces providing bursts of flavor. The sight of noodles being pulled by hand, their strands stretched thin, and then dropped into boiling water, would have fascinated passers-by and drawn crowds eager for a hot, filling meal. Grilled skewers of meat, likely pork, mutton, or fish, were another favorite. Vendors set up braziers along the streets, the smoky aroma drawing customers from afar. These skewers were seasoned with salt, garlic, or early spices like pepper, providing a rare treat of savory richness in diets otherwise dominated by grains. Flatbreads or steamed buns often accompanied the meat, creating hearty, portable meals. For many townsfolk, these skewers represented indulgence, a small luxury purchased with hard-earned coins. Soups and porridges were also ubiquitous. Large cauldrons simmered with millet, rice, or beans, flavored with vegetables, herbs, and bits of preserved meat. For just a small fee, a customer could receive a steaming bowl that warmed both body and spirit. Vendors often operated from dawn until late at night, ensuring that laborers, travelers, and even night watchmen could find sustenance whenever hunger struck. The constant bubbling of these pots became part of the rhythm of city life, their aromas blending with the chatter and clamor of the marketplace. Street food was not only about eating, it was about community. Stalls clustered together in markets, creating vibrant social spaces where people met, exchanged news, and shared meals. Eating in the streets was an equalizer, where peasants and merchants might sit side by side, savoring the same dumplings or noodles. In these spaces, food was both nourishment and connection, binding diverse groups together in shared experience. The government, aware of the importance of markets, often regulated street vendors. In major cities, stalls were organized into designated areas, ensuring order and cleanliness. Some vendors specialized in certain foods, passing their recipes down through generations. Others adapted to changing seasons, offering warming broths in winter and cooling fruits in summer. This variety ensured that city dwellers always had options, turning the streets into ever-changing theaters of taste and smell. Imagine walking through Chang'an at twilight, lanterns flickering as smoke rises from street stalls. The air is thick with the scent of garlic, grilled fish, and steaming dumplings. A vendor shouts to advertise his noodles. Another tends skewers sizzling over coals, while children run past carrying flatbreads wrapped in cloth. Musicians play nearby, adding rhythm to the chatter of merchants haggling over goods. In this atmosphere, food is more than fuel. It is part of the life of the city, woven into its noise, its light, and its heartbeat. Street food also reflected innovation. Vendors, eager to attract customers, experimented with combinations of flavors and techniques. Some discovered that adding fermented sauces or pickled vegetables to porridge made it tastier. Others used sesame oil or pepper to distinguish their dishes. In this way, street food became a laboratory of flavor where new culinary traditions often began. Many dishes that are staples of Chinese cuisine today likely had their humble beginnings in the bustling markets of ancient cities. The legacy of ancient Chinese street food lies in its accessibility, variety, and vibrancy. While emperors feasted on rare delicacies, ordinary people found joy in a bowl of noodles, a dumpling, or a skewer purchased from a street vendor. These meals were quick, affordable, and delicious, grounding daily life in the comfort of familiar flavors. Street food gave voice to the creativity and resilience of the people, ensuring that even in the busiest and most crowded corners of the empire, food was always close at hand, ready to nourish body and soul. If the streets of ancient Chinese cities reflected the tastes of ordinary people, the imperial kitchens revealed a world of extravagance, refinement, and careful ritual. Within the palace walls, food was more than nourishment. It was a statement of power, wealth, and divine authority. To feed the emperor was to sustain not only a man, but also the very center of the empire. Meals prepared in these kitchens were grand spectacles, blending artistry, tradition, and political symbolism in every dish. The imperial kitchens of ancient China were vast, employing hundreds, sometimes thousands of cooks, attendants, and servants. Each had a specific role: butchers, fishmongers, bakers, soup makers, brewers, and tea attendants. The scale of organization was immense, resembling a military operation dedicated entirely to the preparation of food. Records from the Han Dynasty describe kitchens stocked with vast supplies: herds of pigs, flocks of chickens, baskets of vegetables, amphorae of wine, and jars of sauces. Nothing was left to chance. The emperor's meals had to be plentiful, safe, and of the highest quality. Meals for the emperor often included dozens of dishes. Pork, beef, and lamb were prepared in myriad ways: roasted, stewed, braised, or seasoned with exotic spices brought along the Silk Road. Fish and shellfish, fresh from rivers and seas, were steamed with ginger, garlic, or soy sauce. Vegetables, carefully selected for freshness and beauty, were carved into intricate shapes or arranged in symbolic patterns. Grains such as rice, millet, and wheat were transformed into noodles, cakes, and dumplings. Fruits, peaches, grapes, persimmons appeared as both dessert and decoration, their symbolic meanings reinforcing messages of longevity, prosperity, or abundance. Every meal was a performance of power. To present dozens of lavish dishes to the emperor and his court was to display the empire's wealth and resources. The diversity of food showed the reach of the dynasty's influence, as ingredients flowed into the capital from distant provinces and foreign lands. To eat at the emperor's table was to taste the empire itself, a reminder of its vastness and prosperity. Safety was paramount in imperial kitchens. Food tasters ensured that no dish was poisoned, and strict hierarchies governed the preparation of meals. Certain cooks specialized in imperial favorites, while others prepared ritual foods used in ceremonies. Ingredients were meticulously inspected, and utensils were often made of bronze or silver to detect toxins. Feeding the emperor was both an honor and a grave responsibility, for mistakes could cost not only one's position, but also one's life. Imperial dining was steeped in ritual. Meals followed carefully prescribed sequences, with certain dishes served in specific orders. The emperor often dined alone, attended only by close servants, but banquets hosted in the palace were opportunities for spectacle. Officials, nobles, and foreign envoys witnessed the grandeur of the imperial table, where food was arranged as much for appearance as for flavor. Dishes were placed with precision, colors balanced for harmony, and symbols embedded in every choice. A fish might symbolize abundance, a peach immortality, a grain harvest prosperity. Nothing was random. Every meal was a reflection of cosmic order. The kitchens themselves were centers of innovation. With resources at their disposal, imperial cooks experimented with new techniques and combinations of flavors. Recipes that began in the palace sometimes trickled into wider society, influencing the development of Chinese cuisine as a whole. The imperial kitchen was both a guardian of tradition and a laboratory of taste, preserving the old while testing the new. Imagine walking into the kitchens of a Han or Tang dynasty palace. Fires blaze in dozens of stoves, smoke rising toward high ceilings. Cooks in rows chop vegetables, butcher animals, and stir steaming pots. The air is thick with aromas. Garlic sizzling in oil, fish steaming in clay vessels, rice boiling in bronze cauldrons. Attendants scurry with trays, while supervisors bark orders to ensure every dish is prepared on time. Outside, servants prepare to carry the finished foods to gilded halls, where the emperor and his court await. In this world, food is not just sustenance, but theater, ritual, and power made edible. For ordinary people, the splendor of the imperial kitchens was unimaginable. Yet these meals influenced the broader culture. Stories of palace banquets spread, inspiring admiration and envy. Recipes attributed to imperial chefs found their way into markets, adapted by street vendors or household cooks. The emperor's table, though distant, shaped the aspirations and tastes of the entire empire. The food of emperors was thus more than personal indulgence. It was a political tool, a religious act, and a cultural beacon. By eating lavishly, emperors demonstrated their dominion over resources. By dining ritually, they affirmed their link to the heavens. By sharing food at banquets, they projected unity and power. In this way, the imperial kitchens were not merely places of cooking, but instruments of empire, feeding both body and symbol alike. The legacy of these kitchens remains in the grandeur of Chinese culinary tradition. The elaborate banquets, the symbolic dishes, the refined techniques, all trace their roots to the palace hearth. The food of emperors was food as art, food as power, food as a reflection of the universe itself. To glimpse it is to understand that in ancient China, what was eaten at the highest table was inseparable from the destiny of the empire. Food in ancient China was not only about survival or daily nourishment. It was woven deeply into the rhythm of festivals, rituals, and community celebrations. To truly see what food looked like in those times, we must imagine the tables set during New Year gatherings, the offerings placed on ancestral altars, and the communal meals shared during harvest festivals. These were moments when food transcended the ordinary, becoming both symbol and ceremony, carrying meanings that echoed through generations. Festivals in ancient China were closely tied to the agricultural calendar. The rhythms of planting and harvesting dictated when communities gathered to celebrate. After months of hard work in the fields, a successful harvest was cause for feasting, with grains, vegetables, meats, and wine shared among neighbors. Such occasions were not only about abundance, but also about gratitude, a way of honoring both the land and the ancestors who were believed to guide and protect it. In these gatherings, food was the central medium of thanksgiving and joy. One of the most important ritual foods was rice, especially sticky rice. Its glutinous texture made it ideal for forming cakes or dumplings, which were offered during festivals and ceremonies. Sticky rice dumplings wrapped in leaves were not only nourishing, but symbolic, representing unity and continuity. During certain rituals, rice was shaped into small offerings for ancestors, each grain embodying the blessings of the earth. To share rice at festivals was to affirm the bond between the living and the dead, between past and present. Meat, though rare in daily meals, played a significant role in feasts. Pigs, sheep, or oxen might be slaughtered for communal banquets, their meat roasted, boiled, or stewed in large cauldrons. These meals were more than indulgence. They were acts of generosity, ensuring that everyone in the community partook in the fruits of collective labor. In ritual contexts, animals were often sacrificed, their meat offered to deities or ancestors before being shared among participants. Such feasts reinforced both spiritual devotion and social unity. Alcohol, particularly rice wine, was another key element of festivals. Poured in libations to the gods or ancestors and consumed in communal drinking, wine symbolized celebration and connection. Drinking games, toasts, and songs accompanied feasts, turning meals into events of laughter, bonding, and memory. The act of raising a cup together bound participants in shared joy just as much as the food did. In some ceremonies, wine was also seen as a means of communion with the divine, a bridge between human and spirit. Fruits and sweets carried symbolic meanings during festivals. Peaches represented longevity, plums resilience, and pomegranates fertility. Honey and malt syrup were used to make sweet cakes, rare treats in a world where sugar was not yet common. These confections were associated with happiness, marking special occasions with flavors reserved for celebration. Children, in particular, delighted in these festival foods, their taste forever linked with the joy of communal gatherings. Rituals surrounding food were often highly structured. In Confucian tradition, the proper preparation, presentation, and consumption of food were seen as essential to maintaining harmony. Offerings of grains, meats, and wine were made with careful attention to detail, each placement and portion carrying symbolic weight. To deviate from these rituals was not merely impolite, but a disruption of cosmic order. Thus, food became a language of devotion, precision, and respect. Festivals were also opportunities for storytelling and performance. Meals were accompanied by music, poetry, and dance, each element contributing to the richness of the celebration. Food fueled these gatherings, sustaining performers and audiences alike. A bowl of steaming dumplings or a platter of roasted meat was more than nourishment. It was part of the theater of communal life, the shared experience that bound people together in memory and tradition. Imagine a harvest festival in a village by the Yellow River. Long tables are set outdoors, laden with bowls of sticky rice, roasted pork, boiled vegetables, and pitchers of rice wine. Children run between the tables, clutching sweet cakes, their laughter mingling with the music of flutes and drums. Elders pour libations of wine onto the ground, offering thanks to ancestors for the bounty of the year. As the sun sets, lanterns are lit, and the feast continues into the night, each dish a symbol of abundance, gratitude, and continuity. At the imperial level, festivals were even more elaborate. Banquets in the palace celebrated victories, alliances, or seasonal changes, with dozens of dishes served in ornate vessels. Ritual foods were carefully chosen to reflect cosmic harmony, grains symbolizing the earth, fish the waters, fruits the heavens. In these grand feasts, the emperor himself was both host and priest, his meals symbolizing the balance of the world under his rule. The importance of festival and ritual foods lies not in their extravagance, but in their meaning. Every dish was a message: rice for unity, meat for sacrifice, wine for joy, fruit for prosperity. These foods connected people to one another, to their ancestors, and to the universe itself. They remind us that in ancient China, to eat was never just to eat, it was to participate in a story larger than oneself, a story of family, community, and cosmos. In the festivals and feasts of ancient China, food became memory, symbol, and ritual. It was through these meals that the values of gratitude, harmony, and continuity were passed from generation to generation. To imagine those tables is to glimpse not only what people ate, but also how they understood their place in the world, sustained by both the earth and the bonds of tradition. In ancient China, food was never regarded as mere sustenance. It was medicine, philosophy, and a way of aligning the human body with the forces of nature. To truly grasp what food looked like in ancient China, we must look beyond what was eaten to why it was eaten, and how each ingredient was believed to influence health and harmony. Meals were crafted not only to fill the stomach, but also to restore balance, prevent illness, and nurture longevity. The foundations of this approach can be traced to early Chinese medical philosophy, particularly the theories of yin and yang and the five elements. Foods were categorized according to their energetic qualities: warming or cooling, drying or moistening, light or heavy. The act of eating was seen as a way of balancing these energies within the body. A dish was more than its flavor. It was a prescription, a tool for maintaining health in a world where formal medicine was limited and prevention was paramount. Grains such as millet, rice, and wheat were considered stabilizing, providing strength and grounding energy. Vegetables like cucumbers or melons were classified as cooling, useful in hot summers to counteract heat in the body. Garlic and onions, with their pungent qualities, were believed to expel toxins and improve circulation. Ginger, warming and stimulating, was prized for aiding digestion and warding off colds. Each food carried a character, and the cook's role was to combine them in ways that balanced both flavor and health. Meat, though less common, was also classified by its properties. Pork was thought to moisten and nourish, while lamb, considered warming, was eaten in colder seasons to strengthen the body. Fish, associated with abundance, was believed to support vitality and fluid balance. Even the preparation method altered a food's qualities. Steaming preserved lightness, boiling added moistness, roasting brought dryness and heat. In this way, cooking itself was part of the medicinal art, shaping the energy of the food before it entered the body. Herbs played a central role in medicinal food. Common seasonings such as cinnamon, cloves, and star anise were valued not just for taste, but for their healing powers. Tea leaves, once used primarily as medicine, were brewed to aid digestion and mental clarity. Soy products, including tofu and soy sauce, were regarded as balancing and nourishing. Fermented foods such as pickles or pastes were thought to improve digestion and preserve vitality. Each ingredient had a place within the broader system of health, transforming the kitchen into a kind of pharmacy. Food was also deeply tied to the seasons. In summer, light, cooling foods such as melons, cucumbers, and leafy greens were emphasized, helping the body stay cool. In winter, hearty stews of lamb, garlic, and ginger provided warmth and strength. Spring was a time for fresh greens and sprouts, cleansing the body after the heavy foods of winter. Autumn meals emphasized grains and roots, grounding the body in preparation for the cold months ahead. Seasonal eating was not only practical, but also philosophical, ensuring harmony between the human body and the cycles of nature. Rituals often reinforced the medicinal role of food. Families prepared specific dishes for festivals that aligned with seasonal or spiritual needs. For example, rice dumplings wrapped in leaves during the Dragon Boat Festival were not only celebratory, but also thought to ward off illness during the hot, humid months. At the Lunar New Year, foods symbolizing longevity, fertility, and prosperity were consumed with the belief that they influenced health and fortune in the year ahead. In this way, food bridged the physical, spiritual, and symbolic realms. Imagine an ancient household in the depths of winter. A clay pot simmers with lamb, ginger, garlic, and fermented bean paste, the aroma filling the room with warmth. The dish is not just a meal, but a defense against cold, designed to fortify the body against illness. In summer, the same family might eat chilled melon, fresh greens, and light fish stews, believing these foods would keep them balanced in the heat. Each season brought its own prescriptions, and each bite carried purpose. At the imperial level, medicinal foods took on even greater importance. Emperors and nobles employed court physicians who prescribed diets to maintain strength and longevity. Recipes were tailored to individual needs, blending culinary art with medical science. Special dishes such as ginseng soups or deer antler stews were reserved for rulers, reflecting both their status and their pursuit of immortality. In this sense, the emperor's table was not only about indulgence, but also about sustaining the divine mandate through health and vitality. The enduring legacy of this philosophy is profound. Even today, Chinese cuisine emphasizes balance, with meals designed to harmonize flavors, textures, and energies. The concept of food as medicine remains central, guiding both daily cooking and traditional medicine. From the humble bowl of congee prescribed for the sick to elaborate tonics brewed for vitality, the principles developed in ancient times continue to shape how food is understood and valued. Medicinal food culture in ancient China reminds us that eating was never only about hunger. It was about health, harmony, and connection to the larger universe. Every grain, every herb, every dish carried meaning, a reminder that the act of eating was also the act of caring for the body and soul. In this philosophy, food was the first medicine, the daily practice of healing that sustained life across centuries. In a world without refrigeration, the challenge of preserving food was one of the greatest faced by ancient Chinese households. Farmers and cooks learned that harvests were fleeting, and that abundance in one season could easily give way to scarcity in the next. To survive long winters, droughts, or poor harvests, they developed ingenious methods of preservation: salting, pickling, drying, and fermenting that not only kept food edible, but also created new flavors that became central to Chinese cuisine. To imagine ancient Chinese food fully, we must see not only the fresh produce and meats of markets, but also the jars, baskets, and storerooms filled with preserved treasures. Salt was the foundation of preservation. By drawing moisture out of foods, salt slowed the growth of bacteria, keeping meats, fish, and vegetables from spoiling. Salted pork, beef, and fish were staples in many regions, providing protein during lean months. Entire families might work together to rub salt into cuts of meat, pack them into jars, or hang them to cure. Salt was so essential that it became a valuable commodity, with salt production and trade tightly controlled by the state in later dynasties. To possess salt was to hold power, for it meant the ability to preserve life itself. Pickling was another vital method. Vegetables such as cabbage, radish, cucumber, and mustard greens were submerged in brine or vinegar, transforming them into tangy, long-lasting foods. Pickled vegetables added brightness and variety to winter diets, cutting through the heaviness of porridge and stews. Jars of pickles lined household shelves, their sour aroma a reminder of resourcefulness. Over time, pickling developed into an art form, with different regions perfecting their own styles and flavors, from simple salt brines to complex mixtures with spices and herbs. Drying was perhaps the simplest and most widespread method of preservation. Fruits like peaches, plums, and persimmons were sliced and left to dry in the sun, their sugars concentrated into chewy, sweet treats that lasted through the winter. Fish and meats were dried over fires or in open air, providing portable and durable food for travelers and soldiers. Even grains were carefully dried before storage, ensuring they would not rot or sprout before the next planting season. The sight of rooftops or courtyards covered with drying produce was a familiar one, a seasonal ritual that ensured survival. Fermentation often overlapped with preservation. Soybean pastes, soy sauce, pickled vegetables, and rice wines all owed their existence to the need to extend food's shelf life. These foods not only lasted, but also grew richer in flavor over time, turning necessity into culinary innovation. What began as survival became tradition, and these preserved flavors became indispensable to Chinese cooking. Preservation also carried social and cultural meaning. Granaries filled with dried grains and salted meats represented security, wealth, and foresight. Families who prepared well for winter earned respect in their communities, while those without stores faced hardship. In villages, preservation was often a communal effort. Neighbors might work together to dry fish, pickle vegetables, or salt meats, sharing both labor and reward. These practices built bonds of trust and cooperation, reinforcing the idea that survival was a shared responsibility. Rituals sometimes included preserved foods as well. Pickled vegetables or dried fruits were offered to ancestors, their durability symbolizing continuity and endurance. Soldiers marching into battle carried dried meats and grains, their rations sustaining not only bodies, but also morale. In this way, preserved foods were not only practical, but also symbolic, embodying the resilience and perseverance of the people. Imagine a family preparing for winter in an ancient village. The autumn sun warms the courtyard, where slices of persimmons and plums are laid out on woven mats, their orange and purple hues glowing in the light. Nearby, jars of radishes sit submerged in brine, their lids sealed with clay. Strips of pork hang from wooden beams, salted and drying in the crisp air. Children help by turning the fruit, while elders check the brine jars for leaks. Every movement is purposeful, every task tied to the promise of survival in the months ahead. Preservation also shaped taste. Generations grew accustomed to the tang of pickled vegetables, the saltiness of cured meats, and the sweetness of dried fruits. These flavors became comforting, reminders of foresight and resilience. In time, they were not only accepted but celebrated, woven into the identity of Chinese cuisine. Even when fresh food was available, preserved foods held their place at the table, offering depth of flavor that fresh ingredients alone could not provide. At the imperial level, preservation allowed for abundance year-round. Palaces stored vast supplies of salted meats, dried fruits, and pickled vegetables, ensuring that the emperor's table was never bare. Trade along the Silk Road expanded these possibilities, introducing new methods and ingredients to the preservation arts. What began in humble villages was mirrored and magnified in the halls of power, uniting all levels of society in the shared reliance on stored food. The story of preservation in ancient China is one of ingenuity and survival. Salt, pickling, and drying turned scarcity into stability, hunger into abundance, and necessity into flavor. These methods ensured that communities could endure hardship while also shaping the taste preferences that define Chinese cuisine. In every jar of pickles, every slice of dried fruit, every strip of salted pork, we see not only food, but also the wisdom of generations, a testament to the creativity and resilience of the human spirit. As the centuries turned and dynasties rose and fell, Chinese cuisine evolved from its ancient roots into the more recognizable forms of the medieval period. The transition was not abrupt, but gradual, shaped by new technologies, trade, philosophies, and cultural exchange. To see what food looked like in ancient China and how it changed, we must follow the threads of continuity: rice, millet, vegetables, and soy, while also noticing the innovations that transformed meals into the more complex dishes of later times. One of the most significant changes was the growing diversity of grains. While millet and rice had been staples for thousands of years, wheat gained prominence during the Han and later dynasties, spreading across northern China. With wheat came noodles, dumplings, and breads, foods that would become iconic parts of Chinese cuisine. What began as simple boiled dough gradually developed into refined noodle dishes and elaborate dumpling traditions, bridging the ancient grain-based porridges with the more varied meals of the medieval table. Vegetables and fruits also expanded in variety. Native crops like cabbage, radish, and soybeans remained staples. But the Silk Road introduced new produce, including cucumbers, pomegranates, and grapes. These imports became increasingly common, particularly among the wealthy, who used them to add novelty and refinement to their meals. The blending of local and foreign crops created new tastes, shaping diets in ways that reflected both continuity and change. Fermented foods, already essential in ancient times, grew in importance. Soy sauce, soybean paste, and pickled vegetables became indispensable seasonings, giving depth to soups, stews, and meats. What had once been survival techniques became culinary arts, with regional variations developing over time. Vinegar, especially from northern China, gained popularity as both a preservative and a seasoning, its sharp tang complementing noodles and meats. These flavors deepened the complexity of meals, moving Chinese food closer to the layered sophistication it is known for today. Meats also became more prominent, especially among the elite. Pork remained the most common, but lamb and beef grew in importance, particularly in northern regions influenced by nomadic cultures. The expansion of empire and trade introduced new ways of cooking and spicing meat, with Central Asian and Persian influences adding to traditional methods. Roasting, grilling, and spicing techniques enriched the cuisine, while fish and shellfish continued to hold symbolic and practical importance in coastal and river regions. Alcohol evolved as well. Rice wine had long been central to rituals and celebrations, but the medieval era saw refinements in brewing techniques. Wine became stronger, clearer, and more varied, with regional traditions developing around different grains and fruits. Drinking culture flourished, with poetry, music, and social rituals tied closely to the sharing of wine. In this way, alcohol remained both a spiritual offering and a social glue, linking ancient traditions to new expressions. The philosophy of food as medicine continued to guide diets, but new medical texts codified and expanded earlier knowledge. Cooks and physicians alike emphasized balance, but with greater sophistication and detail. Dishes were tailored not only for taste, but for health, longevity, and even mood. Imperial courts invested heavily in medicinal foods, reflecting the belief that the health of rulers was inseparable from the stability of the empire. Thus, food retained its dual role as nourishment and remedy, a tradition rooted in antiquity but refined in the medieval age. Technological changes also shaped this transition. Improved stoves, woks, and steamers allowed more precise cooking. Iron replaced bronze in many kitchen tools, making utensils more durable and efficient. These advances enabled new techniques, such as stir-frying, which would later become a hallmark of Chinese cuisine. The shift from clay and bronze to iron and steel reflected broader changes in society as technology transformed both daily life and culinary practice. Social changes influenced food culture as well. As cities grew, street food flourished, offering noodles, dumplings, and skewers to busy urban populations. Markets became more organized, with vendors specializing in particular dishes. The diversity of food available in cities mirrored the diversity of the empire itself, as regional traditions mingled and overlapped. In this environment, Chinese cuisine began to take on the richness and variety that still defines it today. Imagine a family in the later centuries, gathering around a meal that reflects both past and present. There is millet porridge, a reminder of ancient survival, but also steaming bowls of noodles, seasoned with soy sauce and vinegar. There are pickled vegetables, fruits like grapes and pomegranates, and roasted lamb seasoned with pepper. The table is both familiar and new, echoing the foods of ancestors while embracing the possibilities of change. In such meals, we see the continuity of tradition alongside the creativity of innovation. By the medieval period, Chinese cuisine had become more complex, varied, and sophisticated, yet it never lost its ancient roots. Rice, millet, vegetables, and soy remained at the core, but they were now joined by noodles, spices, and new cooking techniques. The ancient philosophy of balance endured, shaping how foods were combined and consumed. Preservation, ritual, and symbolism continued to define meals, even as new flavors expanded the palate. The transition from ancient to medieval Chinese cuisine is the story of adaptation and growth. It shows how a culture rooted in survival, ritual, and philosophy embraced innovation without losing its identity. Ancient China laid the foundation: the grains, the vegetables, the sauces, the balance. Medieval China built upon it, creating the vibrant and enduring culinary traditions that continue to define Chinese food today. In this way, every bowl of noodles, every sip of wine, every bite of dumpling carries echoes of both the ancient and the timeless. As we come to the end of this journey through the kitchens, markets, and banquets of ancient China, it is clear that food was never just about eating. From the first farmers along the Yellow and Yangtze Rivers to the grand feasts of the Han Dynasty, and the influences of the Silk Road food shaped culture, health, politics, and even the way people understood their place in the universe. Each grain of millet, each steaming bowl of rice, each jar of pickled vegetables carried not only nourishment, but also meaning, memory, and connection. We saw how rice became the lifeblood of the South, how millet and sorghum sustained the North, how tea began as medicine before becoming a cultural cornerstone, and how fermentation gave us flavors like soy sauce that continue to define Chinese cuisine today. We walked through crowded markets filled with street vendors, stepped into the imperial kitchens where food became ritual and power, and joined in the festivals where dishes were symbols of joy, continuity, and gratitude. Along the way, we glimpsed how ancient people lived, survived, celebrated, and dreamed through food. Food in ancient China was a story of balance between hunger and abundance, earth and heaven, survival and celebration. It was medicine for the body, meaning for the spirit, and art for the senses. Though thousands of years separate us from those ancient meals, their legacy endures. When we eat rice, sip tea, enjoy noodles, or season food with soy sauce, we are tasting echoes of a civilization that understood the deep relationship between people and the food that sustains them. If you've enjoyed this long exploration, don't forget to subscribe to History for Sleep. This channel is here to bring you gentle but detailed journeys into the past, designed to help you relax and drift into rest. In the comments, let us know when you listen. Do you play these stories as you fall asleep? Or do you use them to unwind during the day? And share what topics you'd love us to cover next. Your ideas guide the stories we tell. For now, close your eyes and let the images of ancient Chinese meals linger. Steaming bowls of rice, fragrant herbs simmering in clay pots, lantern-lit banquets filled with music and laughter, and families gathered around hearths with simple porridge. These are more than meals. They are stories waiting quietly across centuries to be remembered. Sleep well, and until next time, may history bring you peace.